Sing the song. You know which one. The one you learned before you learned anything else. Before you could read a sentence, before you could write your own name, before you understood what language was or how it worked, you learned the song. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. 26 letters in a specific order, set to a melody borrowed from a French nursery rhyme, drilled into your memory so early and so deeply that it became part of your cognitive infrastructure. You don't think about the alphabet. You know it, the way you know how to breathe, the way you know which way is up. The sequence is in your bones. Now ask yourself something you have never been asked. Why that order? Not why those letters. Why that sequence? Why does A come first? Why does Z come last? Why does Q precede R? Why does M sit in the middle? Why does J, which didn't even exist as a distinct letter until the 1500s, sit between I and K as if it had always been there? The order of the alphabet feels natural. It feels inevitable. It feels like it couldn't be any other way. And that feeling, that sense of inevitability, is the most effective evidence that the order was designed. Because natural things don't feel inevitable. They feel variable, random, organic. Only engineered things feel like they couldn't be otherwise. Only systems that have been deliberately constructed and then taught so early that they bypass critical examination feel like the natural order of reality. The alphabet has an order. That order was chosen. And the deeper I went into who chose it and when and what the order was before they changed it, the more I found a history that the modern world has compressed into silence. Start with the age of the sequence. Because the first thing that surprises you about alphabetical order is how old parts of it are and how recently other parts were changed. The broad outline of the sequence, near the beginning, the core consonants in roughly their current positions, can be traced back over 3,000 years to the Phoenician alphabet, the ancestor of virtually every alphabet used in the Western world today. The Phoenicians arranged their letters in a sequence called the abjad order, and that sequence was inherited by the Greeks, modified by the Romans, and transmitted through Latin into every European language that uses the Latin script. But inherited doesn't mean unchanged. And this is where the silence begins. Because the alphabet you know is not the alphabet the Romans used. It's not the alphabet the medieval scribes copied. It's not the alphabet that was taught in English schools before the 1700s. The sequence has been modified. Letters have been added, removed, rearranged, and repositioned at specific moments in history by specific authorities, for reasons that were never explained to the people who were taught to memorize the result. This raises a simple but critical question. What was the original order, and why was it changed? The deeper I went, the more I found that the question has multiple layers, because the alphabet wasn't rearranged once, it was rearranged repeatedly. Each rearrangement corresponded to a specific institutional transformation. Each transformation produced a sequence that served the needs of the transforming institution, and each new sequence was taught to the next generation as if it had always been that way. Pull up the history of individual letters. Because the history of the alphabet is not a smooth, continuous evolution. It's a series of specific, documentable interventions. The letter J didn't exist before the 1500s. The sound that J represents was written with I for the entire history of the Latin alphabet. Julius was Julius. Jesus was Jesus. The distinction between I and J was introduced by the Italian grammarian Gian Giorgio Trissino in 1524. The new letter was gradually adopted across European languages over the next 2 centuries. It was inserted into the alphabetical sequence between I and K, a position that it had never occupied because it had never existed. The insertion wasn't natural, it was editorial. Someone decided where J would go, and the decision was taught as if J had always been there. The letter U didn't exist as distinct from V until the late medieval period. The Romans used V for both the vowel sound and the consonant sound. The distinction between U and V was formalized gradually between the 1400s and the 1700s. In some traditions, U was placed before V. In others, V before U. The order wasn't settled until printing standardized it, and different printers standardized it differently until a consensus emerged that was taught as if it were original. The letter W, literally named W, created in the medieval period by combining two V's or two U's to represent a sound that Latin didn't have. Inserted into the sequence after V, a position determined not by phonetic logic but by typographic origin. The letter exists because of a specific historical circumstance, the need to represent Germanic sounds in the Latin alphabet, and its position in the sequence reflects that circumstance, not any systematic principle. The silence was deafening when I started mapping how many letters in the modern English alphabet occupy positions that were determined by editorial decisions made between the 1400s and the 1700s. Because it's not just J, U, and W. The entire end of the alphabet was restructured during this period. The positions of letters that the Romans didn't use, that were added to represent sounds in Germanic and Celtic languages, were determined by printers, grammarians, and educators whose decisions were shaped by the specific cultural and institutional needs of their moment. As if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. Now go deeper. Into the Phoenician original. Because the Phoenician abjad order, the sequence that is the ancestor of every Western alphabetical arrangement, wasn't random. It was meaningful. Each letter in the Phoenician alphabet had a name, and the names weren't arbitrary labels. They were words, objects, concepts. The sequence of letter names told a story, or encoded a teaching, or preserved a mnemonic system whose content has been so thoroughly obscured by 3,000 years of transmission that modern scholars can barely reconstruct what it originally communicated. Aleph, ox, beth, house, gimel, camel, daleth, door. The Phoenician letter names described a sequence of concrete objects that progressed in a specific conceptual order, not random objects, a sequence. From the ox, the fundamental unit of agricultural wealth, to the house, the shelter built by wealth, to the camel, the vehicle of trade and movement, to the door, the threshold between inside and outside. Each letter name was a concept, the sequence of concepts was a narrative, and the narrative was the alphabet. The deeper I went into the reconstruction of the original abjad sequence, the more I found scholars who have argued that the letter order encoded a cosmological teaching, a creation sequence, a description of the world's structure from the primal creative force, the ox, the bull, the symbol of generative power found across ancient Near Eastern religion, through successive stages of manifestation, house, threshold, water, fish, fence, weapon, hand. Each concept building on the last, each letter name adding a layer to a description of reality that the sequence itself transmitted. This is extraordinary, and it's almost entirely absent from how the alphabet is taught. Children learn A, B, C as arbitrary symbols in an arbitrary order. They are never told that A was an ox, that B was a house, that the order of the letters once carried meaning, that the sequence was a text, a compressed cosmological narrative encoded in the most basic structure of literacy itself. The meaning was in the order, and the order has been rearranged. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across every alphabet derived from the Phoenician original, because each daughter alphabet, Greek, Latin, Cyrillic, Arabic, Hebrew, inherited the order and then modified it. Each modification stripped away meaning. The Greek alphabet adopted the Phoenician sequence but changed the letter names. Alpha, beta, gamma, delta. These are adaptations of Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Daleth, But the Greek names are phonetic labels. They don't mean ox, house, camel, door. They don't mean anything. The semantic content of the original letter names was emptied during the transmission from Phoenician to Greek. The order was preserved. The meaning was removed. The alphabet became a sequence of sounds rather than a sequence of concepts. And then the Latin alphabet inherited the order from Greek, modified it further, and transmitted the modified sequence to every European language that would adopt it. Each transmission preserved the broad outline of the original order. Each transmission removed more of the original meaning. By the time the English alphabet reached its current form, the connection between the sequence and its original semantic content had been completely severed. A was a letter, not an ox. B was a letter, not a house. The sequence was memorized as arbitrary. The meaning was gone. Here's where the history becomes specific to the English alphabet. Because the English alphabet wasn't standardized into its current 26-letter current order form until the 1700s. Before that, the alphabet was variable. Different texts presented different numbers of letters. Different sequences were taught in different schools. The distinction between I and J, between U and V, was inconsistent. W was sometimes included, sometimes not. The alphabet was a living, variable system that different authorities configured differently depending on their educational philosophy, their linguistic tradition, and their institutional allegiance. The standardization happened during the same period that keeps appearing in every investigation I pursue, the period of the printing press's dominance, the period of institutional centralization, the period when every variable, local, organic system of knowledge transmission was being captured, fixed, and controlled by technologies and institutions that required uniformity. The deeper I went into the printing history, the more the standardization of alphabetical order looked less like a natural process of settling on the best sequence and more like an industrial requirement. Printers needed a fixed sequence because movable type was organized alphabetically. Typesetters needed to know where each letter was stored in the type case. Dictionaries, which were proliferating in the 1600s and 1700s, needed a fixed sequence to organize their entries. Filing systems, library catalogs, indices, every information management technology of the early modern period depended on a fixed alphabetical order. The order wasn't fixed because it was correct. It was fixed because the technology demanded it. And once it was fixed, it was taught to every child, drilled into every mind, made so foundational to literacy that questioning it became literally unthinkable. You can't think about the alphabet without thinking in the alphabet. The order is precognitive. It's installed before critical thinking develops. It's the first algorithm you ever run, and because it's the first, it becomes the template for how you process all sequential information. First things first, a before, beginning before end. The alphabetical order doesn't just organize letters, it organizes thought. It trains the mind to process information in a specific sequence and to treat that sequence as the natural order of things. I'm not telling you the alphabet is in the wrong order. I'm telling you the alphabet has been in multiple orders over its 3,000-year history. That the current order was fixed during a specific period by specific authorities for reasons that had nothing to do with language and everything to do with information management technology. That the original order carried semantic content, a sequence of meanings encoded in the letter names, that was stripped away during successive transmissions from Phoenician to Greek to Latin to English. That the order you memorized as a child is the product of editorial decisions made by printers and grammarians in the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s, and taught to you as if it were as old as language itself. I'm asking what the original order meant, what cosmological teaching was encoded in the sequence from Aleph to Taw, what the Phoenicians were transmitting through the structure of their writing system that 3,000 years of modification has obscured. What was lost when the letter names were emptied of meaning and the sequence became arbitrary? What kind of mind the original alphabet was designed to build? A mind that encountered a cosmological narrative every time it recited its letters, versus the kind of mind the modern alphabet builds, a mind that processes an arbitrary sequence and calls it foundational knowledge. I'm asking why A comes first, not the historical answer, the original answer, the answer that the people who invented the alphabet would have given, the answer that was encoded in the name Aleph, the ox, the primal creative force, the beginning of a sequence that told the story of reality itself in 22 symbols that every literate person memorized before they could read a word. Go sing the song again, A, B, C, D. Feel the sequence. Feel how natural it feels. Feel how inevitable. And ask yourself whether that feeling is recognition or training. Whether you're remembering something true about the structure of language or repeating something installed before you could question it. Whether the order of the letters is the order of the world or the order of a printing press. Handed a sequence and told it was the only one.